Good afternoon. I did a little dynamic adaptive design even as you were all having lunch. I was inspired a little bit, inspired in the sense that many of us are sort of treading in the same conceptual territory, so I had to swerve a little bit based on some of the theoretical material that had already been laid out by my other keynote speakers. So I've evolved, and now I'm here with a new tale to tell, which is one that's even more abstract than the one that I'd started with, so look out. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think is maybe a conceptual model for what lies between the landscape of the real-time city and the sort of social reality of the nodal points that Jiri discussed, and what I've begun to call this organizational model, geomorphic organisms. Now, what I mean by geomorphic organisms is that, well, first of all, we'll unpack the set of words a little bit. Geomorphism, traditionally in geography, is the idea that the landscape is shaped by the activities around it. The landscape is a result of forces acting on it. But in this case, I'm flipping that around a little bit and saying that what I'm describing as an organism is a collection of people whose behavior and interaction with space is now being collectively shaped by their encounter with the landscape in real time. And what I mean by that is that there are mechanisms that are binding these individuals together into collections that are so tight that they function almost organismically, and the way that that organism as a set of actors moving through space, much like a multicellular organism, it has responses to the environment that give it shape and give it behavior. And so I think that there is something very kind of pregnant with possibility in the prospect of looking at the way that we behave in the new real-time city, and actually the environment as a whole in this way. The first thing to consider about the idea of a geomorphic organism is how is it constituted in terms of its topology? How is it brought into being as a set of multiple cells? Now these cells, I'm using the word cell kind of in a multiple meaning, because I'm talking both about a biological metaphor and also the cellular deployment of network services that we find in the city now. And what I mean by that is that now we have a dynamic set of people that are interconnecting with each other, and as they join a group connection, they become part of a multicellular organism, and that organism's shape is defined by the axes of those connections, whether they're local, whether the shape of that connection is across space or across the ability to perceive different things about the network itself or about the social metadata that surrounds the people participating in the group. So there are now ways in which these topologies can come together, and you can start to come up with a taxonomy to describe the different types of topologies of these sets that you can get. So you end up with different types of meta-organisms in the way that people come together. They begin to form different you can look just at the way that these connections have been formed and begin to infer something about where these groups are operating, what they're doing, and why they're doing it. So you now begin to have a botany or a way of a taxonomy of describing different groups. So I think one of the things that's the most interesting about how the way that these different actors come together as collectives is the type of surface they form with the sort of a network of stimulus that they're participating in. There is obviously, there are a lot of different things that we now perceive as individual actors in our daily experience. We perceive the built environment, we perceive our emotional states, we perceive network activity, we perceive financial markets, we perceive delays in transit systems, and all of these factors now are potentially types of maybe proteins that are moving through the network that our collective, our sort of collective experience can be achieving as a group. And so what we end up doing is, as a superset of individuals that are participating in perceptual activities out across our environment and then relating those back into a group, we're sort of defining what I'm calling the envelope of sensation around this multi-participant organism. And so that sort of group dynamic becomes self-rationalizing as people realize that what they're doing among their peers in this group is trading a certain type of information. Those connections begin to calcify, and much like the formation of structures in the brain, you end up with a very specific set of information that's being traded across the members of the group. And so you end up with this kind of what I would call differentiation into specific roles for members of the group. And also you end up with a sense of what, given an arbitrary stimuli in the environment, you get a sense to how there's a stimuli response that you can perceive for the whole group, not just an individual. So there's a group dynamic and a group input-output mechanism that sort of defines how they all behave together, not just as individuals. Another thing that's interesting about having a group that has cohesion as a flow of media within members is that you can start to build collaborative models of things in the environment. So you end up with a set of views onto the same object that begin to define it in space, sort of this matrix camera style rotation around an object. This screenshot that I have here as a reference is from Photosynth, which is a Microsoft research project, which some of you may have seen before, which is a technique that they're using to build 3D landscapes of the environment using concatenations of pictures taken by hundreds of people from different angles. They can actually fill in larger landscapes with these fragments. And I think that, whether you're using an explicit technological framework like Photosynth or not, you already have a cognitive model of something, whether it's an event out in the world that's happened in the news, whether it's a person who everyone in your group deals with on a daily basis, whether it is a certain company or brand. Everybody in the group has a set of statements that they trade back and forth constantly to reinforce the group understanding of what that entity is. And it's part of it's sort of the collective experience and part of how a group is defining themselves by sort of sharing their opinions. And this is sort of what I'm getting to in a larger sense, is that not just individual objects now, because we're sort of pivoting around them as we view them from different angles on the network. And when I say different angles, I don't mean just different spatial angles, but I mean different analytical angles. We have lots of tools and lots of lenses of visualization and analysis that we can now aim at any entity or concept, and different people will configure different views that they sort of want to express to the group as a statement about how they perceive that object. And by sort of compiling all of those views, you end up with a much richer experience of what that object is or that entity is as a collectively viewed target. And so I guess what my suggestion is that there's actually a process that's very similar to a biological process of metabolization of stimuli rather than sustenance. I mean, for the group, in terms of a perceiving organism, the group is actually taking in, as its sustenance, stimulation. It's taking in data, it's taking in experiences from the world, it's taking in network information, and applying a relatively standard process to it, which is to say that it is applied, tags are applied, an ontology that is relevant to the group itself, an internal language that has been developed over the life of the group begins to shape where this thing sits inside an internal data set of relationships that create a model of the world for everyone to share in the group. So basically you're situating, the metabolic forces that take in stimuli are a process of the group application, almost like, a filtering process, or the cilia that you find in, that are extracting nutrients and proteins in the digestive process in animals. It's actually extracting the metadata and using that metadata to reinforce internal structures within the group that talk about the way meaning is modeled among all the people that are participating. So to return to a subject that we've talked about a little bit before, I just wanted to reiterate some of the things that Yuri was talking about in terms of what people have come to expect from their environment. And I think this is really critical that, there was a discussion also of the politics of what an interface like this means in terms of its sort of location in the commercial space and people's sort of subscription to the model that the commercial space is providing. I guess what I'm proposing in making reference to World of Warcraft is not that, the specific tool is something that's really going to provide us with the answer, but instead that there's a type of literacy that comes from exposure to an environment like this, which activates certain processes in the way that people socialize in space and the way that people socialize around objects. And I just wanted to sort of point out some of the things in this interface that are really interesting, and I think that also sort of speak to some of the processes that I'm talking about in terms of the function of these geomorphic entities. On the upper left-hand corner of the slide, there are a whole bunch of groups and the statuses of all those groups, color-coded in little shaded rectangles. And those things are changing. I mean, one of the things, of course, that would be useful to do in a demonstration of something like this is to show this unfolding in real time, because one of the things that's really interesting about the WoW interface is how packed with real-time information it is. It's one of the highest bandwidth kind of ways that people interact with computers. There are certain other application circumstances like financial trading and air traffic control that have as much real-time activity in the environment that is respondable, that is interactable, has handles on it. But this is actually probably one of the highest bandwidth pop cultural articulations of interaction with computational environments. So just to build on that, there's also in the lower left-hand corner there's the chat system in WoW, which is also interesting because it is a palimpsest. It is layered and overlapping, meaning that you can be joining 5 or 6 different sort of valences of chat at the same time. You have actually in the right-hand side, you have a series of events that are happening locally, and the left-hand side, you have conversations that you're having with your guild, with the party that you're currently in, with the people in the room. So you have faceted ways of real-time communication, and I think that's also key to understanding what I'm talking about in these morphogenic organisms, is that they're also overlapping, that an individual can be participating in multiple of these organismic sort of confabulations of experience at the same time. So in talking about what it is that, most, when we define what life is considered an autopoietic process in the sense that it is self-sustaining, and it is something that sort of its own autonomic processes continue to deliver it energy that allow it to move forward and find more of the material that it needs to deliver itself energy. So it continues to propagate. And one of the things that's interesting about the kind of internal mechanics of these groups is this process of continually being in a very active sense. Like there are multiple mechanisms now that we've evolved through social technology that allow us to constantly activate, but peripherally activate our awareness of other people that are participating in the group or groups that we're a member of. So we have sort of a constant partial awareness of all of the people that are participating in the group, which is very much like the prior perception that one has of one's own body. It's actually just it's a cybernetic extension of our own ability to be self-aware in a way, because now we're self-aware on the scale of a local group rather than a local set of physical cells that we're actually attached to, but we actually now have these social cells that also are giving us feedback in terms of, is it in pain? Is it cramped? Whatever it is, it's all showing up right here. The cells are communicating with each other, and that actually continues to shape the way that the organism behaves, the way that the group, the collective action, is a response to where this sort of echoing and broadcast and rebroadcast of sort of neural stimulation that happens internal to the group begins to affect how it behaves across the landscape. So just to reiterate, this is, one of the things that's critical about understanding how that works is that you don't necessarily, with Twitter you get a situation, a lot of these social networking tools give you an overview. They show you this is the landscape of the people that you're participating in this sort of collective awareness with, and so we're going to give you sort of an aggregate view, and you as an individual will always sort of have a map of what the organism as a whole is doing. But the other possibility, of course, is that you have, much like with flocks and swarms of animals, there are local triggers. You don't actually see what's happening in the whole group, but you actually just, something propagates across the network, which is a signal that's just a flip of a fin in the case of a fish where it begins to swim to the right or whatever. And, because you're participating in the language of the group and you understand what that stimuli means, the probabilities of you responding in the way that everyone else that you're in the group that you're participating in is quite high. And so you will actually, there's a possibility that behavior will also propagate as well as the stimulus. So it means that the group is actually acting consciously in the Twitter sense and unconsciously in sort of the local stimuli kind of flocking sense. The group is maneuvering across the landscape of its environment and its data space. So what does this mean for the city? It means that we now have, well, I guess what I should say is we've talked about a lot of how the internal communication system works in one of these geomorphic organisms. But what does it mean, where is the geo when what I'm talking about? Where is the actual connection to the city, the connection to the landscape, and how is that, how are decisions made by the group in terms of how they are going to move across the landscape and engage with the objects in their environment? And this is where we come to the concepts that I think are at the core of Stamen's experience, which also begin to characterize the landscape in a very dynamic way. One of the sort of criteria for projects in which Stamen wants to engage is that they look for things that are live, vast, and deep. And that means that they look for data sets that are pouring in such a way that they can create a real-time visualization of that data that has activity in which patterns can be drawn not just from the connections between pieces of data, but over time you can see the rhythm and the texture of how those patterns evolve and change. And so you begin to understand the way that a system moves, not just as a static representation, but as a flow of relationships. And that's something that's really important, I think, in understanding the real-time city, is this idea of constant incoming flow and change in the way that the relationships are perceived. So I'm actually going to see if I can swap out to we have a couple of things lined up here. I'm going to swap out, this is the work of Tom Carden, who's one of the people at Stamen, and this is a map that shows travel times from the Department for Transportation in London. And one of the things that's interesting about this map is that you see, well, a couple of things that are interesting. One, that I always find interesting in giving talks like this is I'm one to, as you might have noticed, abuse biological metaphors right and left. And the thing that's interesting about when you start doing data visualizations on this scale and with data about real human activity across, technologically instantiated infrastructure, you end up with something that looks awfully biological. This that we're looking at right now is a range of travel times across the tube system in London, and so the outer edge, the outer perimeter that's darkening are things that are beyond the rightmost edge of the constrained slider there, and the things inside are too short of a journey. So we're looking at a slice of travel times from the Department of Transport's office. We can add a second layer here, which is housing costs in London. So this is potentially, if you had some serious constraints on what you could spend and where you were working, you wanted to find out where you could live that was affordable and also the right distance away from where you where you needed to go, you could sort of start to layer these sensibilities on top of each other. And what I'd like to suggest is that, while this is an instance that's built by Stamen and has a very specific viewpoint, it has a target for its destination, it has a kind of rule set for how the mapping is made between the sort of raw data and the visualization of that data. This is the sort of understanding, I believe, that is sort of becomes implicit unconsciously in the collective understanding of a city that one of these geomorphic organisms compiles for itself. There is sort of folk data within any clique of people that are users of a city in which they express to each other their understandings of the quickest routes and the places you should never go if you're trying to, where you shouldn't transfer on the tube and where you should, how it is you should walk between two given points in the city. And those trails and those maps, whether they're explicitly recorded or not, are part of those little pinging messages that are traveling back and forth inside the group at all times. Whether it's implicitly, in a Twitter message that says, "Oh, I got stuck at Victoria Station again," which just, is added to your stack of understanding of what's bad about Victoria Station, or, whether it's like a transit map that somebody links to in their Delicious feed that, talks about some of this information, that sort of compiling into the group awareness of the city is a specific sort of facet, a specific media relationship between that tribe and its use of the city. And so, for every tribe, there is a different visual metaphor that one might apply, a different set of data, but there is sort of a visualization of the city that's latent in the data set that any group has collected about it, the way that it's using the city in which it lives. I lost the presentation. There it is. So when I say chemotaxis, this is a term that I coined in a previous presentation, which chemotaxis is the process by which cells in a chemical bath navigate by detecting different chemicals on their surface. So they sort of respond to stimulation. If there's a certain pH balance in one pocket of the fluid, the cell will propel itself toward that pH balance, or a nutritive protein is over here, so it's going to head that direction. And I believe that is, I'm sort of loosely mapping this sort of idea of chemotaxis onto the idea that we're stimulated by the sort of memes in which we're constantly bathed. We're bathed in little fragments of information that are coming from all different directions all the time, and we consciously or unconsciously respond to those stimulations by either moving toward them or away from them, or flinging them away from us or consuming them, and going through that sort of metabolic process that I was talking about. And so the group is constantly kind of engaged with this negotiation in the city with the stimulation that the city is providing, and the group is constantly reforming itself along different axes of data and space, in its relationship with the city. So the next thing that happens, so the chemotaxis is kind of what I would call the sort of unconscious, collective unconscious of the group, the way that it kind of, certain memes, lolcats or whatever, like sort of cascade through the group and sort of defines a part of the language that people use to describe their situation. But then the next level, which I think is where we're headed, the threshold that we're at right now, is the idea that one could actually articulate purposefully a recipe for how one would use the city through mobile services. So this is the thing that I think is going to be interesting, is that right now, one of the things that's interesting about WoW, which I showed before, or about really any operating system or sort of configurable environment that you use, is that probably among the sort of social tribe that you participate, you probably have kind of recipes that you pass back and forth for configuration of those services. I know this is the best way to use Firefox with these extensions, or this is the best IDE that I use to do programming, and a lot of times there are huge battles inside groups about what's better. But ultimately, kind of consensus is reached about this is kind of how our group approaches doing raids in Warcraft or whatever, and it's a kind of procedural recipe, and it deals with a certain number of additions to the default set of technologies that that group might run so that they can now kind of become customized as a group for the way that they interact with each other and the way they interact with the world outside. So I think that's one of the things that's interesting. In Adam's talk, he was talking about, the activation of the city and its, active users as applications and tasks. And I think that's very much what the way that people will begin to perceive of those contexts, like the way that they move into space, the way that they use a building like the Beurs van Berlage, for instance, is that there is a momentary configuration. This is an event. I think that's really key to recognize, is that now urban contexts and situations are not necessarily written in stone in the same way they were when the buildings were first built. This is definitely not this is not the default use that this building was built for, but now we have remixed it into something completely different. And I think that the activation of the possibilities of that remix is going to become faster and faster. And the fact that there'll be different ways of having groups dynamically activate spaces in different ways is very much about a scripting language for the city, and the idea that people will be able to describe to each other in high-level language how they're hoping to compose a situation in an urban environment. And everyone will be able to, much like a wiki, people can collaboratively sort of edit this model, vote it up and down, like on Dig, and sort of bring it into existence as a temporary configuration of urban resources. And I think that's definitely how the activation of the city is kind of evolving. And I think that the way in which once those situations have been materialized, the ways in which we as groups engage in the sort of unfolding of the event itself that happens in those spaces, I think the stream of events that we're experiencing as a group very much harkens back to that WoW screen that I just put up, which is to say that we're constantly at play in the space of possibilities about the city. And so this idea of remixing and this idea of instrumental play as well as gameplay, but the idea that you're playing an instrument and that instrument happens to be your environment, is something that is very much more empowering about the way that we engage with our day-to-day life. If configuration becomes a fluid process, then it's no longer sort of a task or an application, but it's something that happens around this kind of group metabolism of what's good for right now. And so it's the satisfaction of a collective desire for how things should unfold from moment to moment. So there is definitely a playfulness to the way that activation happens, and a playfulness to the way that people sort of reappropriate buildings that were built for one use into another, or sampling culture in general is reappropriating all of these different media. And I think that experience itself, the moment of the pattern of what is happening around you is sampleable, and the fact that you can as a group you can express that sampleability to each other and then play it out in the environment is going to be part of the new I guess it used to be that every time a medium became nonlinear, we talked about it becoming a desktop medium, which is old. There is no desktop. And so now it becomes, it's put in play, I think, is a new way of looking at the type of activation that these systems are undergoing. Books were put in play, music was put in play, and now the urban environment is put in play. So I guess, my wish, my aspiration, what is the trajectory for this kind of evolved social behavior of group action as a geomorphic organism? I think that the fact that we can, as a group, articulate our ideal for the right now at every moment. We can be influencing the way that our group is acting and the way that our group is moving through space to try and enact our ideal in our environment. And I think that the language, that we've evolved to communicate amongst ourselves, in a way, I think that's ultimately the thing that binds these groups together, is their vision of utopia, is that there is an ideal, language, the language that's used to criticize what's wrong about things, Victoria Station sucks, well, what is the answer? There is a virtual other Victoria Station, which is the one that doesn't suck. and those, everyone in the group can continue to try and refine what their understanding of that virtual Victoria Station that doesn't suck is, and go there by activating the environment together. And so what I would say is that, whether, the politics of these groups being able to write this action into their environment is obviously contentious, because there are going to be hundreds of thousands of these groups. Everyone is already in multiple tribes, and obviously the tribes, tribes are territorial, and part of what a tribe, the action of a tribe is to try and write its own vision of utopia onto space. That is kind of what gave rise to all this nation-state business in the first place. And I think that there's obviously a lot of trouble there, and there's a lot of things that need to be worked out, but I think that at least within the group, the fact that we're developing this kind of metabolic process of constantly revising our understanding of what utopia is and moving towards it is a way for the society to continue to uplift itself. And I think I will close with that.
Thank you very much, Ben. So we have time for 2 questions. Somebody else is going to do the microphone for me, so who would like to ask the first question? Like so.
Well, hello, thank you. Jure Okma, Fijelt. I want to react on your last comment. You stated that creating thousands of utopia would be a benefit for society itself. Don't you think it's just vluchtweg to get away from reality?
No, I think it's part of I don't think that any of those utopias will ever be fully inhabited, and I think that part of the process of this kind of group navigation is recognizing the tension between the desire of utopia and the current state of affairs, and recognizing it's a way of being able to articulate what it is that you find wrong with now. The difference between utopia and the current state of affairs is a set of factors that differentiate a possibility from a reality. So it's not that you're constructing these utopias just to inhabit and forget about the world. Instead, you're using them as aspirational targets along which you're moving from now into the future. So it's not so much about being trapped in something that's static, but continuously articulating a possibility.
Hi, my name is Yuri van Geest. I have a question. Looking into the next 10 years, what will be the impact on the mindset, attitudes and behaviors of people immersive in the environments? Do you have some ideas about that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there are, one of the things that obviously, comes up when talking about something like this is the fact that not everyone is participating in the sort of this technological infrastructure that enables what I'm talking about. And certainly, sort of pre-digital technology already, the book, there are plenty of technologies that already provide ways for people to build the sort of common language that makes them into sort of a conceptual organism. But I think that in the future, that there is the possibility, I think that the sort of dystopic possibilities certainly include the breaking down of people's ability to communicate across these groups, right? If you fall into a certain subset that has a language that begins to sort of reinforce itself and face inward, then you lose contact with things outside that group. And I think that's certainly super important. And I think part of how I imagine that might be mitigated is that, you know, if people are all participating in multiple of these sets, then they, as individuals, are sort of propagating ideas across the groups. And so the groups still, you know, are interconnected into the fabric of society as a whole, rather than just being these little islands. But obviously, the other thing that I think already happens to us, and I think is going to increasingly happen, especially in the circumstance of something like this kind of active group awareness, is technical failure. I mean, what happens when the network disappears? And I think that the person in 15 or 20 years when the network disappears is going to feel like they've lost a limb, literally. I mean, that's what I mean about this sort of biological metaphor, is that, like, you know, right now, already, you know, when Twitter is down, there's panic. So, and that's nothing compared to where we're going to be in terms of collective perception experience in the next 10 or 15 years. So, you know, the idea that it'll be like being blind. You know, the idea that your social ability to experience the world is gone is going to feel like you're blindfolded and gagged. So I think that's going to be, you know, and of course that means that the power to control those connections means that it's going to there'll be more mechanisms to enforce things on you if that is the possibility of being taken away and you're you know, constituent in it.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben.